Hello, YouTube. I was just doing some thinking, driving around, and uh, I got to thinking about a YouTube comment that showed that there was some misunderstanding, which is probably really prevalent, and it's about the misunderstanding in question is the issue of Kantian ethics, and I think it's probably a really popular misunderstanding. I think it's something that if you don't read the critique of practical reason, you won't understand um, exactly what his argument is. Now, I'm not a Kantian. I'm not a deontological ethicist, um, and I'll point to where my issues are after I just explain the argument. Um, the the misunderstanding, though, specifically, is about the status of, whether or not Kant viewed his ethical system as being objective, right? Whether or not when we talk about Kant, we're talking about objective moral values, right? Um, and the answer is no. It's not. Kant uh, believed firmly that ethics was subjective and yet universal, right? And I'm going to unpack what that means by taking a quick detour through Rousseau, right? Now, Rousseau, of course, political philosopher, wrote The Social Contract, very important person. Um, America, the United States of America, our Constitution was written under very, very directly with reference to Rousseau. So I think it's, in order to understand the thinking that went into American politics, or the creation of American politics, you have to have a grasp on Rousseau. Um, Now, one of the central moves that Rousseau makes, what he's trying to do is he's trying to resolve a basic conflict. That is, how can we reconcile law with freedom, right? It would seem that if you legislate for somebody, you are infringing on their autonomy, because they're taking orders from the outside. Um, this is a big no-no for Enlightenment philosophers who are very much concerned with human freedom, human autonomy, and the question of legitimacy. The question of the legitimacy of the law, right? So a good law would be one that doesn't suppress human freedom. So law and freedom seem to be in contradiction with one another. It's very difficult to deal with, right? Especially given the how law was justified at the time, which was the idea of the divine right of kings. So God, through God, the monarch is, his power is legitimate, right? So, for the Enlightenment figures, for Rousseau, the question becomes, how is power, political power, legitimate in the absence of God, right? And how does it exist with respect to human autonomy? And the answer that he comes up with is what's important for the conversation about Kant. The answer that he comes up with is that the law has to be self-legislated, right? So I have to will the law onto myself. In that way, it's not disrespectful of my autonomy. It doesn't minimize my autonomy, and at the same time, the law then draws its legitimacy from the people, right? This is essentially a highly democratic argument. the people have to will the law into existence, and then legislate for themselves and abide by the law willingly, in order to keep the people together, right? So what I want to point to here is that he takes the divine right of kings, right, which references something out there, God, right? God is something that is out there. It's beyond man. And he takes that and he makes it immanent in the world. He makes it from the people. He makes it material. So the form is essentially the same, but he takes God and he makes it into a material consideration, immanent in the population, and this is where law gets its legitimacy from. Now, this is important because this is what is sort of the same move that Kant makes. Kant, previously, in medieval philosophy and such, ethics is more or less legislated to us by God. It's, the ethical or the good is in correspondence with God's will, in one form or another, whatever that means. Kant takes this out-there-ness, right, which he sees as sort of imposing on human beings, and he tries to more or less preserve a form of Christian morality while removing God from the picture of Christian morality, sort of. Kant was a believer, and he has a really interesting argument for the existence of God, because he doesn't even deal with it, actually. His argument is actually that it would be, ethics would be incoherent without God. That's how he approaches the argument. So he doesn't really touch the actual existence, but it's rather that we have an ethical imperative to believe in God. That's how Kant deals with it. And you can look all that up, and you can look up Kant's argument for this. I think it's an interesting argument. I don't buy it, but I think it's interesting. So what Kant tries to do is to take ethics out of the divine and make it immanent, in the same way that Rousseau did this with law. Now, how does ethics respect my autonomy? How does ethics become a space for freedom? Right? It seems like it would be in contradiction to the idea of freedom. Well, I have to legislate the ethical law for myself, right? That's Kant's basic gesture. Now, usually you find the religious people making this kind of argument. So if I don't know if I have a Christian audience, but if I do, they might be saying something like, well, how, this is relativist. If everybody is, legislating for themselves, how is it not my opinion versus your opinion when it comes to what's ethical? And Kant saw this as a really big problem also. And so what Kant wants to say is that any statement about ethics implies what he calls the categorical imperative, right? And I'll put the quotation or the definition of the categorical imperative in the description box, but it's basically just a restatement of the golden rule. It's a little different. The idea is that if I want to know if driving a car is wrong, what I do is I ask, well, what if everybody drove a car? I universalize the idea, and then I look for the problems in that. And that's the basic move behind Kantian deontological ethics. Now, his contention is that the categorical imperative is transcendental, right? That is to say, it's a feature of human psychology. It doesn't quite transposed, but in some way, in modern terms, that's what it means. It's a feature of my subjectivity. When I undertake actions, I have to invoke something like the categorical imperative in order to have a moral being at all, right? So the categorical imperative for Kant is just part of being human, which makes it universal, right? It is true for all human subjects, but it is also subjective. That is, I'm not referring to anything outside of myself in order to come to moral judgments. So this is what I mean, and I had an exchange about whether or not Kant's ethics was subjective. Kant's ethics is subjective. It's part of what constitutes human subjectivity. But it's also universal in that it applies to all free, rational agents. Use any adjective that applies to Enlightenment thought. It applies to all of these agents. So again, in some way, you could look at the whole project of the Enlightenment as taking religious ideas and reinscribing them into the secular world. Kant even goes one step further and actually has a book entitled something like Thinking Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. Yeah. And here's where I have my issue with Kant, right? Kant's ethics, the idea is, in order for an action to be ethical and to be free or autonomously undertaken, I have to do the action for its own sake. I can't be concerned about the consequences of the action. That is, once I start getting concerned about the consequences of the action, then all of a sudden I'm enslaved, right, for Kant. And I agree to an extent. So everything has to be for its own sake. When I undertake an ethical action, it has to be for the sake of the ethical action, and for the sake of and based on how I evaluate the ethical action, rather than for some consequence, right? In Thinking Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, Kant undertakes the question, well, is it possible to do evil for its own sake, right? Which is a fascinating question. Kant's answer is extremely unsatisfying, I think, and that's, you could imagine, for instance, for an example of the best example of evil for its own sake, or what Kant calls radical evil, because this is where you get this term, is the Christopher Nolan Joker, right? So he gets all this money and then burns it. You know what I mean? He has no interest in the reward that he could get for his actions. He just it's all about criminality for its own sake, and this is what makes the Joker so terrifying, I think. Some men just want to watch the world burn is the idea, right? Kant's answer to this is that it can't exist because it would destroy itself. Maybe. I think it's unsatisfying, though, because I think that the real problem that's raised by this is that if you really look at radical evil and the good in Kant, they're indistinguishable. So that becomes an issue for me, or what I think is at least an interesting issue that Kant kind of shies away from. He doesn't really address it. He doesn't really try to grapple with the full consequences of his own system. So that is one of the more fascinating dimensions of Kant. So yeah, human freedom. It's what the Enlightenment is all about, and reinscribing the religious into the secular. Like you can't. I don't think that you can understand Kant or Rousseau without understanding this basic gesture of resacralization, right? And this goes one step further then, to a more interesting place. Maybe I should just stop the video here, but I think I'd like to raise the question, which is that if Rousseauian politics is contingent on the religious, and he goes so far, the last chapter of the social contract is called On Civil Religion. This is necessary to bind a people together. Civil religion. Certain practices in America, we would think of things like saying the Pledge of Allegiance, or the relationship that we have to people who died in war, right? Or things like this. These are all sort of part of civil religion. Or the national anthem, which is particularly interesting because Rousseau actually prescribes sports for his as part of a civil religion. The idea being it's something that we all get together in the light of day, and you can see everybody. You see the people in a certain way in the light of day, and everybody cheers together, and everybody establishes these basic bonds of solidarity. And I think we see that in America, especially because we sing the national anthem beforehand. So the question that I want to raise is to what degree American politics is religious, if that makes sense. We might go one step further and say ritualistic, right? I don't want to use religious in this new atheist sense of implying the supernatural, but to what degree is American politics a religious enterprise, and to what degree does it need to be? To what degree is politics itself contingent on a gesture of religion? One more thing that I just remembered and I just thought of. This video is getting really long and rambly. The issue of human freedom, right? I have to legislate for myself in the sphere of ethics, and we have to legislate for ourselves in the sphere of politics and in Enlightenment thought. This also opens up a space for a different conception of religion. And it's a space that Kierkegaard really inhabits. The idea is, and Oscar Wilde too, his conception of Christianity is related to this idea, that if I believe something on the basis of evidence, and it's not saying that it's wrong to do that, but if I believe something on the basis of evidence, then I am constituting my beliefs on the basis of something outside of myself, which means that my subjectivity is constituted in such a way that it's entirely dependent on the world out there. In some way, I can't be an autonomous agent. And this could, and I'd like to hear people's arguments against this idea. It could open up the space for faith. The notion being that it's not, faith is not belief on the basis of something out there. It's belief on the basis of my own autonomy. It emerges from within, and it has to emerge from within. It has to be something that I will into being. It has to be something that I wrestle with, and it has to be something that is prescribed for myself, right? It, in some way, what this does is it makes it so that, like, the notion that evidence as a category, evidence having to do with things outside of myself, becomes totally and completely irrelevant to the question of religion. And it's in my opinion the best response to the sort of positivist atheist idea that the burden of proof is on the believer, and therefore the believer should have to supply evidence. In some way, the Kierkegaardian argument is that, and I think it's a very, very much steeped in the Enlightenment. It doesn't. It's meaningless to ask for evidence, and it would defeat the purpose of religion itself to ask for evidence. I think that Kant kind of takes that stance, but Kierkegaard makes it very explicit. So that's a whole bunch of topics at once in one video, and I apologize for the length of it. Please comment and subscribe, and I hope the video finds you well, and have a good night.